The dark history of wife selling. Why you wouldn't survive it. The part that gets me isn't that it happened. It's that nobody, not the courts, not the magistrates, not the men running the livestock markets where some of these took place, could agree on whether it was legal or not. For about 2 centuries, England couldn't collectively decide if selling a human being at a cattle auction was a legitimate legal procedure. There were magistrates who said they weren't sure they had the authority to stop it. There were poor law officials actively encouraging it. There were newspapers running coverage of specific auctions with the tone of someone describing a mildly embarrassing local custom rather than a crime. 200 years of this. The answer for the record was no. Wife selling had no basis in English law at any point. Not one statute, not one precedent, not one judicial ruling that recognized it as valid. And yet it happened somewhere between 300 and 400 documented times between the 1690s and the early 1900s, with an unknown number of undocumented cases on top of that. The last recorded instance in England was 1913. A woman in a Leeds police court testified she'd been sold to one of her husband's workmates for £1. 1913. The same year the zipper was patented. The same year Cary Grant was born. That's not the Middle Ages. That's not even close to the Middle Ages. The ritual had a specific format, which is one of the things that makes it genuinely difficult to process. The husband would announce the sale in advance, sometimes through a town crier, literally hiring a man to walk the streets shouting that his wife was going up for auction, and then lead her to the marketplace with a halter around her neck or waist. A livestock halter. At an actual livestock market frequently. Smithfield Market in London, the cattle pens at Canterbury, the pig market at Birmingham, the horse fair. The husband would put her in a stall, announce a starting price, and take bids from whoever showed up. In 1820 in Canterbury, a man led his wife into the cattle market and asked one of the regular livestock salesmen to handle the auction. The salesman said, fairly reasonably, that his professional dealings were with cattle and not with women. The husband paid 6pence for a stall anyway, led his wife in on a halter, and sold her to a young man for 5 shillings and 6pence. 5 shillings. The salesman's objection was procedural. Not moral, not legal, not humanitarian. Procedural. He didn't do women, he did cattle. That was the extent of the resistance on offer. Here's the thing that complicates the straightforward horror of it. And I want to be careful about this because it actually matters for understanding what was happening. In the overwhelming majority of documented cases, the wife knew about it in advance and agreed to it. Of the 218 cases historian E.P. Thompson studied in detail between 1760 and 1880, 4 were conducted without the wife's knowledge or consent. 4 out of 218. The rest were, in a deeply warped way, mutually arranged. Which sounds almost worse when you first hear it, and then starts to make a grim kind of sense once you understand what the alternative was. Before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a legal divorce in England required a private act of Parliament. This was not a technicality. It was a financial wall that effectively made divorce the exclusive property of the aristocracy and the very wealthy. The process cost thousands of pounds, required legal representation at multiple stages, and had to pass through both houses of Parliament as individual legislation. Between 1700 and 1857, there were around 325 parliamentary divorces total. England had a population of millions. Do the math. If you were a working class couple and the marriage had collapsed, and marriages collapsed, then as now, for every reason marriages have ever collapsed, your legal options were stay in it, abandon each other informally, and risk prosecution for desertion or bigamy, or do this. Put her in a halter, walk her to the market, make it public, make it witnessed, make it official in the only way available. The wife sale was a working class divorce ritual. Both parties understood it as such. The buyer in most recorded cases was already known. The wife's new partner prearranged, present at the auction as a formality. The halter and the public bidding were theater, deliberately designed to make the transaction visible enough that the surrounding community would recognize it as binding. Historian Lawrence Stone argued that the entire elaborate symbolic apparatus existed specifically to make the separation appear as legally valid as possible, and in particular to establish publicly that the first husband was surrendering all future financial claims on the woman. No more maintenance obligations. So in 1824 in Manchester, when a wife was auctioned at the cattle market and knocked down to a bidder she didn't like, she refused him. Outright refused. The husband didn't drag her out. He put her up for a second round at a lower starting price and kept going until she found someone she found acceptable. She had a veto inside a livestock auction for the price of 3 shillings and a quart of ale. I've been sitting with that detail for a while and I still don't entirely know what to do with it. It's a system that recognized women as people with preferences and the capacity to refuse, and then expressed that recognition entirely within a framework that categorized them as tradable property. Both of those things were true at the same time, and nobody running the auction seemed to experience any particular cognitive discomfort about it. In 1832 in Carlisle, a woman was sold for £1 and a Newfoundland dog. I've thought about that transaction more than is probably warranted. The dog was likely a meaningful part of the consideration. Newfoundlands are large, expensive working dogs, genuinely valuable in a working-class household. But still, £1, a dog. The receipt exists. It's in the historical record. That same year in Canterbury, a woman described in contemporary newspaper coverage as decent looking, because newspapers felt that was relevant information, was sold at the cattle market for 5 shillings to a young man whose name is recorded. She outlived both him and her first husband and married a third time, conventionally, after both of them were dead. The contemporary account records this with what reads almost like grudging admiration. She made it through. 3 marriages, 2 sales, and she's still standing. Good for her, genuinely. In 1858 in Bradford, a man named Hartley Thompson put his wife up for sale wearing a ribbon around her neck. He'd apparently decided a ribbon was classier than a halter, which is a distinction I find both understandable and completely insane in context. He'd had the sale announced through the streets by a bellman the previous day. The local newspaper described it as one of Bradford's brutal exhibitions of depravity, in a tone suggesting Bradford had seen enough of these to have developed a settled editorial position on them. In 1862, a man in Wenlock sold his wife for 6pence and a quart of ale, which at that point wasn't even enough to cover the stall rental at some of these markets. The transaction was witnessed by several people, a bill of sale was drawn up afterward, and both parties considered themselves legally separated. They were not legally separated. None of them ever were. The poor law angle is where I lose patience entirely. By the early 19th century, local poor law commissioners, the officials responsible for managing poverty relief, had in at least several documented cases started pressuring husbands to sell their wives rather than maintain destitute families on public funds. Not prosecuting the practice, not ignoring it, actively encouraging it as a welfare cost reduction measure. The logic being that if the husband sold the wife to a new man, financial responsibility transferred to the buyer, and the parish was off the hook. At least one magistrate went on record in the early 1800s stating he wasn't certain he had the legal authority to prevent a wife sale even if he wanted to. The Church of England had been formally condemning the practice since at least the 1690s. Various courts had prosecuted it intermittently over the decades, and the poor law apparatus was using it as a budget management tool. All simultaneously. For 200 years. The church saying no, the court saying maybe. The poor law office saying, please do this so we don't have to pay for your family. When the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act finally created accessible civil divorce courts with reasonable fees, wife sales dropped sharply and almost immediately, which is about as clear a confirmation as history ever provides, that the practice had never been about tradition or cultural attachment or some deep folk custom with roots in the Saxon age. It had been about the cost of divorce. Make divorce financially accessible and the cattle market auctions stop. Make it impossible and people build parallel systems inside pig markets with halters and town criers and witnesses and notarized bills of sale. There's a case from 1884, Doncaster, a man named James Brooks, where the bill of sale drawn up after the transaction was so formally worded, so carefully constructed to resemble a legitimate legal document, that it was apparently taken seriously enough for someone to bother keeping it. It transferred ownership of one Mary Brooks to one Thomas Seton for the sum of 2 shillings and 6pence. It had witnesses. It had the date. It had a description of the woman that reads like livestock paperwork. Mary Brooks, for what it's worth, had requested the sale. Thomas Seton was her choice. She'd arranged the whole thing. James Brooks was, by all accounts, a drunk who hit her. The bill of sale was her exit strategy. 2 shillings and 6pence was the price of a clean break in 1884 Doncaster. It wasn't legal. It wasn't binding. James Brooks could have walked back into her life at any point and the law would have recognized him as her husband. But he didn't. And she built a new life with Thomas Seton. And apparently nobody in the community around them treated the original transaction as anything other than what it was. A divorce? Just one conducted in the only venue available to people who couldn't afford a lawyer and an act of parliament. In 1896, a man charged with bigamy offered as his legal defense the fact that he had previously sold his first wife at public auction, and therefore the first marriage no longer counted. The court was not persuaded. He had a point though, in the worst possible way. Not legally, never legally, not once in 2 centuries did any court recognize any of these transactions as valid. But in terms of what the communities around these people had understood and practiced and passed down as working class custom for generations. The halter, the marketplace, the public announcement, the witness transaction, the bill of sale. All of it carefully, deliberately constructed to say, this is real, this is final, this counts. It didn't count. The law said it never counted. There are 300 documented cases with receipts, some of them notarized. The last one was 1913,